Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. My guest today is Michele Mitchell. What a delightful conversation Michele and I had about her new film, The Uncondemned. She's a filmmaker, she's a documentarian. I would say she's a journalist, she's a lover of life, she's a very passionate person, and she's got lots to say about justice and about her film and about genocide and about Rwanda. She's won the Edward Murrow Award for Best Television Documentary for a film called Haiti, Where Did the Money Go, back in 2013. There's a lot going on, not only in this interview, but you need to see her film that she co-directed with Nick Louvel called The Uncondemned. It's going to be premiering or airing at least at the Toronto Human Rights Watch Film Festival coming up in the next week or so. So I challenge you, I encourage you to get out and to see it. We talk a lot about social justice, we talk about change, we talk about, a responsibility to others. We also talk a little bit about clog dancing. So I hope I got your interest. I hope I piqued your interest, and you're going to, like I said, you're really going to enjoy this conversation I had with Michele, and come on out and meet her at the film festival coming up. DavidPeckLive.com for more interviews, and Michele Mitchell and The Uncondemned. Well, welcome to Face to Face, and we are joined by a very special guest today, a filmmaker, here to talk about a movie that's going to be released in a couple of weeks, I think, in Toronto, called The Uncondemned. Michele Mitchell is here. Michele, thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
So we're going to be talking about your newest film, The Uncondemned, directed by you and Nick Louvel, your co-director, which I'm sure we're going to be talking a little bit more about sort of the process and how it all came together. But first of all, I want to say congratulations right out of the gate. It's a difficult, compelling, and challenging film.
Well, I hope it was also inspiring, right?
Incredibly inspiring. You how can it not be, right?
Well, that was one of the challenges, obviously, is how do you take this subject and make it digestible, where people want to go and watch it. And so hopefully that's what we did. We tried to make a legal thriller, and fingers crossed we accomplished it.
Well, I have to say, the opening, and probably, what is it? You can help me out here, but maybe 7 or 8 minutes, it really did have the legal thriller feel to it, and just so compelling. This opening, the music, the editing, and so on, the stories, and there was almost this sense of mystery about. I knew what the film was about, but there was you created a real huge question mark for me as the viewer.
Oh, great! Well, again, when you're tackling a story that happened almost 20 years ago, and if somebody wants to Google the case and find out how it ends, they can do that. It's like, okay, how do we make sure that we have suspense in this? So thank you. I'm very pleased to hear that it sounds like we accomplished a couple of our goals.
So how does a filmmaker decide to say, I find it fascinating. I continue to interview more filmmakers all the time, and with the Human Rights Watch Film Festival coming up, which is in the next couple of weeks for all our listeners out there, how do you decide to make a film about this and not that?
Well, the type of films that we make tend to be almost investigative, and that's usually how it starts off. And the root of that is almost always me getting mad about something.
Funny.
Our first documentary, which was Haiti, Where Did the Money Go, which aired on television. It was not a feature doc. It was a made-for-television documentary. That started because I was learning French at the time, which is a terrible experience if you're over the age of over the age of 15. If you're learning French and you're old, it really is not a good experience. But my teacher was from Haiti, and the earthquake happened in January of 2010, and she went down in March of 2010, and during our lesson said, "Oh, Michele, if you could be there in those camps at night and hear the women cry, it would break your heart." And I said, "Well, what happened to all the money people donated to all these major charities? Wasn't there supposed to be plenty of money down there? Where did it go?" And then, of course, I was like, "Wait, this is what I do. I track this stuff." So that came about just because I had the question I'm sure a lot of us had, which is what happened to the money. And then this one, I was actually out promoting the Haiti documentary. I was on the west coast of the U.S., and so this is 2012, and there was an election going on, and U.S. elections are always good for something.
We call them game shows up here in Canada, actually.
Yeah, that's very appropriate. Well, one of the episodes of the game show in 2012 was this gentleman who was running for Senate, a U.S. Senate seat from Missouri, and he said in an interview that women could not get pregnant from being raped because they had a way to shut down their bodies.
Yeah, we remember this.
Remember that one?
We do.
I almost drove off the road, and I thought, okay, well, the Serbs didn't get that memo.
That's right.
What are you talking about? And so I decided, like, you know what? I need to. I'm going to do something about this. I am going to tell a story that puts this act so firmly into where it should be, which is an act of power, torture, and humiliation, that you will never be able to get away with saying something like that again. And then I thought, okay, well, I don't want to depress myself for the next 3 years, right? That's how long a film it takes at least. I want to tell a story about what to do about it. And so it became, okay, let's tell the story of the first time that rape was prosecuted as a crime of war. And I honestly thought it was going to be a very famous case called the Focha case from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And this was a case that had a lot of articles, a lot of coverage. It was these women in Bosnia who were held effectively in rape camps, is what they called them, and raped repeatedly. And it was a very famous case that went through The Hague. So I actually spent about 6 months researching that in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I happened to be at a screening for the Haiti documentary in Bellingham, Washington, at the Pickford Theater, and I was having a glass of wine with a human rights lawyer. She said, "What are you going to do next?" And I said, "I'm going to do a film about the first time rape was prosecuted as a crime of war." And she says, "Oh, Akayesu." And I was like, "What is that?" I never heard this. She says, "The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda." And I was like, "What? When did that happen?" And then she said, "You need to talk to Pierre Prosper." I'm like, "Who's Pierre Prosper?" And she's like, "Oh, he's Haitian American. You'll love him." I'm like, "Oh, great, another Haiti angle here." So then I talked to Pierre maybe 3 days later, and that was January of 2013. And I remember getting off the phone, and I turned to Nick, who was finishing up something, and he was really looking forward to getting back to narrative filmmaking. And I said, "I think you might want to stick around. I think this is going to be pretty good." So that's how it happened.
It really is remarkable, when you look back, the chain of events, the little things that, one of the messages I go on about all the time is, incremental change and little things making a big difference. And I think that definitely for me is one of the inspirational things to take from your film as well. Remarkable how one or two testimonies, more than one or two in this case, made such a significant difference and will continue to forever, really, right? From a justice perspective and a legal perspective. But isn't it remarkable how those little meetings, that somebody said something to you and you said, "What? Tell me more." And out of that comes this film. I love that stuff.
Exactly. And one of the crazier things that came about of little tiny moments that you're referring to is the Lisa Pruitt part of the narrative in this film. And Lisa Pruitt is the lawyer who was sent to do that special report about whether or not there was enough sexual violence to charge Jean-Paul Akayesu with rape as a crime of war. And that was an element of the story that nobody knew about. And the only reason why that came about was I was mistakenly given her report. And I wasn't even supposed to have it.
Wow.
And then while I was reading it, I had already been to Rwanda, and I had already met witness JJ and OO. I'd met them on my own, and I knew their real names. And so I'm reading her report, and I at a bar, drinking a glass of wine, and I remember spitting out my glass of wine. I spitting out the wine because there was a name on there that I was witness JJ's name, and I was like, holy cow, are you kidding me? It was like I rubbed my eyes for a second. I couldn't believe what I was looking at, and I was like, what is this document? Who is this person? And then, of course, I hunted her down, and you know, because you've seen this, you know exactly how aware she was of the role that she played. So it was pretty incredible. That combination, that 1-2 combination, that was, I think, two of the best days
amazing.
of my career. Mm-hmm.
But before we jump into more about the film, have you always been like this? Like, I mean, I've studied philosophy for years. Neo in the Matrix. It was the question that drove him. Is it that mystery? Is it that unknown? Is you said I got to get mad about something before I really go in. Is that since you've been young, you've had that sort of sense and spirit?
Well, apparently yes. Although I didn't think so. I mean, what I wanted to do with my life was be the great American novelist, and you can see how close I came.
Come on, you really wanted to join the circus. I've read the bio.
Don't give people any ideas. I had a friend hack into my Wikipedia page once and say that I was a champion clog dancer, and I don't read my Wikipedia ever, and so I didn't understand why I was getting all these invitations to clog dancing.
Oh, that's awesome.
I don't want to give your audience any ideas. But,
will you be doing that at the Q&A for the Human Rights Watch Film Festival coming up in Toronto?
Yeah. You know what's totally awesome to do at a screening of a film about justice and international war crimes is clog dancing.
Bring your clogs. That's awesome.
But I at a fairly young age, I grew up in Southern California, and so at a pretty young age, my parents, who are lovely but not imaginative people, took my sister and I traveling. And one of the big trips we took was to the Eastern Mediterranean, and we went to Turkey, Cyprus, Israel, and Egypt. And this was in the early 80s, so it was very, very exotic to go all the way from Southern California there. And but one of the things that was happening at that time in Israel was the beginning of the first Intifada, and I was caught actually in a crossfire. I mean, I don't even got called a crossfire. I mean, there was a soldier firing at a man who was running, and I got sort of pulled into a bread shop and put on the ground, and I was like, I was really young. I was like 13 years old, and
wow.
I said, what's happening? And I'll never forget it. The guy in the store said, someone has been bad. I'm like, someone has been bad? What do you mean someone has been bad? What does that mean? And that was the first step, actually, the most essential part of journalism. Why is that guy shooting at that guy? And I was really caught up in this idea of what makes somebody want to put their life on the line for a cause, and why do people do these things to each other? Why? And then you start peeling through that, and you find these stories. I also, by the way, I have to say that if you're as lucky as I have been in the sense of, I was born in the United States. I lived an upper middle class life. I had a great education. With that comes responsibility. You can't waste that. You have to take those enormous benefits that you have been given through the grace of fate, and you have to do something positive with it.
It's a nice phrase, the grace of fate. Yeah, it's really good. It's interesting, for me, and I wouldn't mind coming back to this. I mean, it sounds like you're more alone than not. I mean, I don't know that everyone feels that same burden of responsibility that comes out of you know what I mean? Like, at the risk of sounding a little critical and judgmental of others. I don't know if it's even. I don't look at it even as a burden. I mean, this is what makes you get up in the morning, and it's a great feeling when you realize that you've done something to make positive change in the world. It's fantastic. When people walk up to me and say, "Hey, I saw your story about, or I watched your film, and now I'm doing this." That's great. That's why we're in this. And that's why those women gave the interviews that they do in this film, because they said, we want to help people.
which is great.
Well, it's
it's
incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. So I've spent some time in Rwanda. I was in Kigali. Got to travel around the country a little bit. Did some work. So I got I got quite a bit of history immersed. Read Dallaire, Shake Hands with the Devil. I've seen many documentary films and so on. So I have a pretty good understanding, and I knew what your film was about going in, but I didn't really know what to expect, obviously. And I think one of the things that struck me when I was there, okay, now I'm going to just sound a little weird, but there was a comment in the film where somebody said evil was at 80%, but goodness was at about 20% during that 1994, that war. You want to call it a civil war, that's fine, but there was also this, massive genocide going on, almost 1 million people who die in 100 days. Just remarkable, the precision and the calculation behind it all. I felt when I was there like something was still very not right. That's really great saying. My wife wouldn't be too pleased with me. But there was just something very unsettling about, and I heard it from others, and it was partially the security that you would see for places that you would go, and of course the memorials and so on. Did you get that same sense as you started to...
I will tell you, it's interesting to be in a place that is basically 20 years, which is not a lot of time.
It's not a lot of time.
An era. And I'm going to actually go back to something that you just said, which was this tendency that some people have to call what happened a civil war. That's no civil war.
Yeah.
And there's pushback. All those voices that you heard in the beginning montage, in that opening montage, and our journalists and photographers who covered both Bosnia and Rwanda.
Right.
And it was important to me that their voices were in it because I call them the class of 93. Nobody else does, so don't get attached to it. But I call them the class of 93 because these men and women changed war reporting. This is the first time that you actually had sexual violence being covered, because before it really wasn't. And those people, the gentleman who said the phrase that you picked up on is a very famous photojournalist named Gilles Perez. And Gilles gave the interview, and others gave the interview because they wanted to push back on this revisionism that's happening. And it happens every 20 years, right? But I don't know how a country comes back from something so terrible. And I hope that there are lots of studies going on by academics and smarter people than me, in Rwanda and in Cambodia and in other places that have seen enormous violence. And the evidence of that enormous violence is so vivid. And I'm very open about the fact that seeing the remnants of that great violence. And then I talked to plenty of folks in Rwanda, and also I went over into Congo. But it's definitely you absorb some of that trauma. It's just enormous trauma, and it's going to take a long time to recover.
I want to come back to this too. Maybe we can wrap up the interview. But you went over to the Congo, and I'm guessing that was to interview the FDLR.
Yes.
And that end. So without tipping your hat or the film's hat, the end scene is just it's just remarkable.
They're not very happy with it.
They are none too pleased.
We were told that it's not safe for us to be in Eastern Congo anytime soon, which is fine by me. I don't need to go back to Eastern Congo. But yeah, they hadn't given an on-camera interview in a very long time. They hadn't talked to an American journalist in a very long time, and I apologize to my brethren out there because I'm not sure how quickly they're going to give another interview. After this?
Did you get much out of them?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a pretty extensive interview, and then we had to stay overnight in that village.
Oh, wow.
3.5 days to get there, and then there was a huge downpour, and the road got washed out, so we were overnight with them. There's some photographs, actually, of where and how we stayed on our website. But it was a long interview, and most of it was talking about how misunderstood they were.
Right.
And I have to say, at one point, I asked them, what do you think is the biggest misconception about you? And the answer was, well, you probably think we're going to kill you.
Oh,
wow. I was like, oh. Wow. And then I said, well, I don't, but Nick does. It's like, just sitting behind me, the camera running, like, thanks.
Oh man, you do have to maintain a little bit of a sense of humor in some of these situations. It seems to
Oh
me.
man, you know what? That beer tasted really good when we got out of there.
Yeah, I bet, I bet. Yeah, I've spent a little bit of time up on that border actually, so I know whereof you speak. Yeah, and I think people need to see the film just for that last scene. Actually, I mean, that's worth the price of admission for sure.
You
So,
know, it wasn't particularly when we're trying to figure out how to use it. I knew exactly what. I mean, I remember when that moment happened, and I was like, okay, this is absolutely worth everything that went into this moment. I mean, 3.5 weeks in Congo for that moment.
wow, is that right, eh? Wow, that's a
Yeah.
long. Yeah, no, but honestly though, that's the moment you could show to a law class, to an international. I teach international development at Humber College here in Toronto, and always looking for clips to show students. I mean, if that's not sort of the thesis statement and the conclusion, I don't know what is. It's just brilliant, and it just encapsulates it in such a small moment. Hopefully, we've piqued some people's interest. So the church knew. The Americans knew. Everyone knew what was going on. What the hell happened?
Well, if you want to watch something in real time that's similar, look at what's happening in South Sudan. Everybody knows what's happening there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's the fact that so many people knew, the fact that there were memos and faxes and all sorts of things on multiple levels that were sent by officials who were in those embassies and et cetera, it's mind-boggling. And I was mentioning to you before we started that my first job was on Capitol Hill, and I remember being on Capitol Hill as a young staffer when the first footage started coming in.
Right.
And there were staffers just kind of stumbling out into the hallways going, did you just see what's on television? And we were all very upset, and our bosses were also upset. And this isn't just me telling this story. This was actually in Samantha Power's book, The Problem from Hell. But there was a bipartisan coalition of representatives and senators who went to the White House saying, what can we do? We want to do something. And the White House said, Bill Clinton said, nothing. It's a tribal issue. So, when people talk about what a great job Bill Clinton did then, what a great job he's done to make amends, the fact that he's been so open about how it was the biggest mistake of his presidency, it makes me feel very queasy because there was political will to do something, and that will wasn't tapped. And that's also sort of what we're hoping to do with the film. It's just like, look, you know what? Let's get the political will together, and then let's go out and force our leaders to do something, to take responsibility, and to push for no impunity.
I was talking with Dane Pratsky a couple days ago, yesterday actually, about his film Frack Man, which is also being highlighted at the festival coming up in a few days. And it's all about activism and kind of the ground up swell. And he's now going to be running for local office. He's a crazy nut, good guy, you'd love him. But it's all about him and this community around him saying, we're not going to take this, we're going to actually try to change the way things are going to be done tomorrow. And I think that's what's so brilliant to me about these women in this film. They're so unbelievably brave to come out, to speak out against this. And what boggled my mind about seeing them is just how delightful and lovely they all seem, during your interviews, and yet they're talking in between these beautiful smiles. They're talking about these deep, deep wounds that are clearly healing on some level, but there's some sort of trauma clearly that's kind of below the surface. But again, encouraged and affirmed that you can make a difference. You can fight back against this kind of evil.
Yeah, and they were, they're, if you want to call them the lucky ones, they had their day in court, right? And then they made history. But it was interesting because they were certainly never expecting to have a film made about them.
Right.
They actually said, we thought the world had forgotten about us until you guys showed up, and which I always thought was really interesting because they were very ready to talk and share their stories. But also, in the interviews with them, I met them a couple times before, but I never asked them, tell me what happened to you. I mean, I know what happened to them. The first question I asked was, why did you decide to testify?
Right.
Which is a much more interesting I think, a much more interesting question. And at no point are you told what happened to them. I mean, you know that something happened because otherwise they wouldn't be called as witnesses. But and I've been asked before, how come you didn't include or what happened, the details of what they went through? And I said because I someday was going to be sitting next to them,
Right.
watching this film,
Right.
and all I could think of was I wouldn't want that information about myself out there. That's not what I want the world to know. I would want the world to know what to do about it. And just a very different way to start approaching this because, they take, they're very clear on what people need to do, speak up, and that includes people who this has happened to at any level. Talk about it. There's no embarrassment, no shame. Talk about it because you're going to be okay. And you know what? You actually just might get some justice.
You sort of, I mean, to me, you kind of start the film out in a way. You talk right out of the gate. It's about, the silence. You talk about the silence in the country. You've got the church knew, the Americans knew, everybody knew, but let's not talk about it. Let's not actually call it genocide because if we do that, what are the implications? And so on. And then you've got one of the Rwandan women later in the film saying, normally we don't talk about our bodies. There's a lot of Rwandan sort of cultural things that go on. And, well, I would say that's pretty much everybody. That's kind of global. And yet there was a sense where, as a father and so on and as a teacher, you go, guys, we got to talk about this stuff for the love. It's a part of what makes us, I don't know, wonderfully human. Does that sound corny? I mean, let's get it out. For the love, let's get it out on the table, and maybe we can address some of this stuff so that it's not going to happen again tomorrow, in a different way, or at least we're going to be able to approach these things in a different way.
Well, we have to, and we have to because there's so many. It laces through almost every facet of our society and our being. One of the things that I talk a lot about, I did a TEDx talk on this, is we don't use the right words. An example, I would say, even beyond war. Let's talk about how this is discussed in conflict. I just received, for example, an email 3 days ago from someone who said, oh, my God, I just was reading this article about these terrible things that happen with rape and conflict, and I had no idea that rape and conflict meant that women were gang raped and that men were raped. I was like, well, what do you think it is? I mean, we're not using the right words.
Right.
One of those words is torture.
Right.
One of those words is, power. But it really is torture. And because we're not talking about it correctly, and it's right now what's happening even with what ISIS is perpetrating, and South Sudan and Boko Haram, and I have seen this in documents. It's being referred to as a soft issue, even at the upper echelons of multiple governments that usually say that this is a big issue for them. The fact is that it's been pushed to the side. It's a hard issue is a beheading or somebody being burned alive or any of these other terrible, terrible things that happen in the course of war. I always say I'm not going to get in a debate on the misery index. All of those things sound really horrible. They all sound like torture. And we have to start talking about this for what it is, and it has to be taken as seriously as any other crime of war. And a full stop. And everything else, to say that it's not as destructive as poison gas or any of these other things is, quite frankly, not true.
There's a psychologist or psychiatrist that's interviewed, and it's certainly a theme and a thread throughout, this notion that this is not about sex. This is about, as you say, it's about torture, it's about power, it's about humiliation, it's entitlement, it's ideology, and it's fear, right? And it's about the fear. It's about what was the line? Something about submission, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's about power, torture, entitlement, and it's about and destruction. It's about the attempt to destroy somebody.
Well, and to get others around that are watching, that are hearing about this, to submit, basically, to bow down to the powers that be, whoever they are at the time.
Yes, because a lot of times these are done in public. Yeah, exactly. And for one of the things we don't talk about in the film because it was there's so many different ways you can go with the story, and you have to keep things. I mean, this is already a complicated enough story because of all the twists and turns that it took legally. It introduced a new facet to the issue when it was too difficult. But let's just talk for a second about how many men are raped. And when I was in Congo, the figure that was cited to me was at least 30% of all the rape victims in Congo are men.
Wow.
And those are the ones we know about.
Wow.
So it's probably higher. But if you think it's hard for women to talk about, it's really hard for men to talk about.
Yeah.
And then I've heard a whole host of other crazy responses. I've had people go, well, what, really? I mean, are these gay men raping? I'm like, no, it's, it's not an act of sex.
Yeah.
This is an act of, like, I mean, and rape can take, the penetration can take, can happen in varying ways. We don't have to be too imaginative to think about what those ways might be. But the thing is that it's, even in that case, we're not talking about this correctly. And for those men, and there are all sorts of terrible stories about these guys the ones who tell medical professionals that this has happened to them. Sometimes they can't be treated because the mission of that particular NGO doesn't allow to treat men, and so they can't. I mean, there's just all sorts and so because we're not talking about this correctly, these NGOs are not able to serve that population correctly. There's all sorts of results of this, consequences rather, to just not talking about this.
So you clearly have done a ton of research around this issue, this crime against humanity, this violence, and so on. It's not about sex; it's about power, and so on. Seems to be I would imagine, some common threads throughout the different places around the world. This has happened over, what is it, I mean, how long have we been writing history? A couple thousand years. But I heard somebody in the film say that some of the testimonies from Rwanda were some of the most brutal ones that they had ever heard. Would you agree with that? And if so, what any thoughts on that? Like, what I mean, one of the mind-boggling things for me when I came out of Rwanda was how it was such a Catholic country at one time.
Well, the Catholic
right?
Church does such a good job dealing with sex crimes.
Yeah, right.
I mean,
Oh man, yes, the history is not great, is it?
Yeah, well, even like the recent experience, like the ongoing problem.
Understatement of the century. Yeah.
Well, one of the I certainly found that the testimonies that I read, the accounts. I know there's a lot of papers out there where people get on the ground fairly quickly and do things like Benaifer Nowoji, who's working for Human Rights Watch at the time when she did her report, and they are really tough to read. They're real. I wouldn't recommend that as bedtime reading.
Yeah.
You're going to have some nightmares. But one of the things that happened in Rwanda was this demonization that the media did of an exaggeration of the sexuality of Tutsi women. And it was a lot of making them sound like they were like these sexually voracious she-devils, so to speak. And that and it was constant. It was like, there were cartoons, it was on the radio, this sense of making them the other, that they needed to be destroyed sexually because that was their power they were wielding. And so that's one reason why, it's a big reason why, according to, again, people who are smarter than me, that you saw such viciousness in the sexual attacks that happened. There were some. I mean, there are two stories which are in the film. There are two moments, as you know, and then that's it. But those were particularly terrible. And I don't know how much. Most people, we don't want to know that these things happen, so it's really because we don't want to think we're capable of that, right?
Well, maybe this is a nice little segue into a couple things. One, I'd love to hear your thoughts more on this. Having spent so much time there and reflecting on it and so on, and maybe going to go on to do more film or writing. 80% evil, 20% good. Wow, I'd like to think that stat's a little high. I'd like to think there's not, maybe this, that person was talking specifically about Rwanda. He was
comparing it to Bosnia.
There you go.
Came out of Bosnia. I thought that, the evil of mankind was 50-50. When I came out of Rwanda, evil was at 20%, and the good was evil was at 80%, and good was at 20%.
So and just to follow from your comment, we don't want to think about it because maybe we're capable. I think you're right. Aren't we all culpable on some level, or capable and culpable, I suppose you could say, in a way?
I think that
It's a tough question, believe me, I get it. We're
yeah,
talking about the problem of evil here, and it's something that I just, having spent so much time in Cambodia, reflecting, reading, and
yeah.
working there, I'm currently reading a book by Alex Hinton called Why Did They Kill? And coming to terms with these sort of, your comment earlier about the generalizations that are made in these kinds of things. And there's always we want to explain it away. Oh, well, the country was demonized, possessed. I've heard people say they were
Mhm.
possessed. I've heard, or Hitler was a madman. Well, actually, I don't think he was. You know,
Well,
you, you,
that's what the story of Akayesu himself is so interesting, because
hmm
here you have a guy who is a moderate, right? He starts out as a moderate Hutu. He's the mayor of this small
He's the
town.
mayor of a
And
small town.
and for the first 2 weeks of the genocide, he prevents it from coming into his town. Like, he's standing out in the road with a gun preventing the Interahamwe militias from coming in and killing Tutsis. But then he's called to a political meeting, and he is told, if you want to have a political future, you need to get with the program.
Right.
And he comes back, and that night the genocide starts.
Yeah.
And so for me, what's so
wild.
fascinating about this is he could have gone either way. Genocide doesn't happen, mass killings don't happen, mass torture doesn't happen because you've got one evil genius at the top.
Right. Right.
Because you have a lot of passive people in the middle who don't say no, and who don't push back, and and that's what makes Akayesu, I think, in a way, so relatable, and scary.
And scary
It
too,
could be
yeah.
anybody.
It could
be anybody.
Well, this is the thing that, sometimes does, in fact, keep me up at night, some of these kinds of things, because I think it's easy for us, especially in the West, to point the finger and say, oh, look at those crazy nuts and what they're doing, over there. I love the way we demonize
Well, you could
people,
say that
right?
about the Republican presidential field. I mean, come on.
Hey, listen, we were just this morning, so yes. Yeah, no, for sure. Well, I think that's my point, right? I mean, I really do believe we're all in this for good or for ill together, and I think that's what fascinates me so much about this. And when these types of things seem to continue to happen, like you said about the Sudan around the world, when the heck are we going to learn, right?
The thing is that we have mechanisms to at least hold people accountable, and we don't pursue those mechanisms nearly as much as we should. And we have the ability to do that. It's going to take us pressuring our leaders and being very clear what we find to be an unacceptable course of action, which is, I'm not saying like we parachute in and we try to solve all these problems, because that's just not going to happen. Let's be real.
Mm-hmm.
And also, we're not going to stop rape from happening in conflict. It's just too effective of a mechanism in war, okay? But what we can do is make it a lot more difficult to get away with. And that scares people. I mean, the FDLR gave us that interview because they are very worried about being indicted by the ICC.
I bet.
And so it's possible to have some stoppage points, where we go, no, that's not acceptable. It's just like the journalists who I was mentioning earlier in this conversation who speak in that montage, who are pushing back at people who want to say that wasn't a genocide. Like, yeah, that was. I was there. I saw it. You don't get to rewrite this. And in fact, one of the journalists says that he did that job because if world leaders wanted to say that they didn't know what was happening, that these guys could say, oh, no, you knew what was happening because we told you.
Right.
So we just have to keep up that kind of pressure. And I think one of the great things about working on this particular film is that as dark of a place as I had to go in order to begin to tell it, oh, my God, the amazing, incredible people around the world who are doing really cool things.
Yeah,
and
it's
I'm
true.
not talking I'll start with those women who are on camera in this film, but in lots and lots of places, and you can, because of social media, we have so much more access to all these folks. But there are so many wonderful things going on and so many really cool people out there fighting the good fight that I have to tell you, like, my faith in humanity and our ability to do the right thing is totally intact.
So that's
It's
awesome.
Intact.
So awesome for so many reasons, and one, because you answered the question I was going to kind of wrap us up with. I always, especially when talking about such a somber and difficult issue and topic as Rwanda and rape and so on and genocide, holy cow, you couldn't get much more somber. are you still hopeful? So it sure
yeah.
sounds like you are. That's pretty cool. Hey, speaking of hope, so in the title, is that UN? Is that tongue in cheek? The Uncondemned?
Well, it's not tongue in cheek. It's a made up word. It does not exist. So, and that came about because we had to call it something.
Well, hey, just so you know, I've added it to my Apple dictionary, so
cool! So it's becoming official.
it's now a real word on my laptop. So
I love it. We came up with it on a subway, right? We were Nick and I were leaving the office. We've been working really, really late. I think it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and we're talking about what we should call this, and we're like, well, these women were condemned, but the men weren't as a result of the act of being raped in conflict, and the men thought that they were going to get away with it, but then the women became, but then the men became condemned, and then the women became, and then Nick said uncondemned, and we were so tired, and we were like, hee, wait, that's actually pretty good. So that's how we came up with that title.
Where do you sit? And we're probably going to have to wrap it up here in a minute. Clearly, we're going to have to do a second part. What are your thoughts on the UN? So many people are negative towards the UN and the work that they do. And I think often, and I've said this before on some of my interviews, when people talk about the UN, they usually talk about the Security Council. Mm-hmm. What do you think about you've worked on this film in Haiti. Clearly you've traveled the world. Are you hopeful there? Is this something that is actually effective some of the time?
Well, I've seen a lot of different types of missions that the
mm-hmm.
UN run.
Mm-hmm.
There's obviously MONUSCO in Congo, and I've seen their operation in Haiti, which I have many concerns about. The UN is a vast entity, and I think what has surprised me is just how big it is and how little all those different divisions actually talk to each other.
Right.
But I think overall that having the UN around is so much. Excuse me 1 second. You guys, you're gonna have to edit that part out.
That's all right.
But I think having the UN is so much better than not having something there, and because at least there's an entity to hold some folks accountable for the terrible things that can and do happen.
I couldn't agree more. Clearly it's broken, but it's such a massive mechanism. How do you? I think hopefully the idea is to get it working a little more smoothly, more and more all the time. It seems to me. So.
Oh, listen, you're a very hopeful man.
I'm a hopeful cynic to the core.
There are many things that the UN can and will do well, but smoothly, I wouldn't be that word necessarily. Look, it's an almost impossible task.
Right? I think you're right.
I think what they do as well as they could, and when the UN screws up, that mechanism has to be in place for them to be held and hold themselves accountable.
So tell me a little bit. You're coming to Toronto. I hear you've never been out of the Toronto airport. The film is the film is going to be released. I'm just double checking again on the timing, but it's like in a week or two. April 5th, I think.
April 5th, exactly.
Yeah. So tell me what's happening on opening night.
Well, I will be there doing a Q&A, but also Sarah Darshori, who is she's the co-counsel in the case. At the age of 27, she was the co-counsel for this enormous history-changing trial. And now she actually works for Human Rights Watch and continues some of her work. So she'll be there doing the Q&A with me.
And a little bit of a clog dance as well, I understand?
We're going to have a little clog dance.
Excellent. Glad to hear it. So Tuesday, April 5th, 6:30 p.m. Make sure you get your tickets. Michele Mitchell here today on Face to Face. Thanks a lot, Michele. Holy smokes! I really, honestly, I often say we got to do part 2, but I feel like we've just, barely scratched the surface on this. Thanks so much for a brilliant film.
Well, thank you, and I see that now you have another reason to come to the screening, right? We can continue our conversation.
And I'm heading out to South Oakville to see if I can find myself a pair of clogs.
There you go. Oh my God, someone is going to click on and edit my Wikipedia. I'm going to keep an eye on it.
You should.
Thanks for going to do that.
Thanks so much for your time today, Michele.
Thank you.